All right, let's get started. Good evening and welcome everybody. I'm so excited to see all of you. Whether you're here at the Japanese American Service Committee in person or joining us online, I'm so glad you've joined us at this very special occasion. My name is Emma Saito Lincoln and I'm the director of the JASC Legacy Center. The Legacy Center is a community-based archives and library focused on preserving the history of the Japanese American community in Chicago. We are situated within the JASC, which is an organization founded in 1946 to meet the needs of the rapidly expanding population of people resettling to Chicago after incarceration during World War II. Today, JASC is a 501c3 nonprofit that works to foster community, preserve history, celebrate culture, and care for our elders. In addition to history-focused programming, we also provide language classes for children and adults, a variety of cultural heritage classes and community events, and both on-site and in-home support for our elders. To keep up with all of the great things happening at JASC, I encourage you to check out our website, sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter, or follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We know the pandemic has impacted the finances of many households, but if you are in a position to give, I hope you'll consider making a donation tonight to ensure that we can continue to fulfill our multi-pronged mission. You can donate in person, donate online, or support us by purchasing books through our bookstore on bookshop.org. I'm going to keep this introduction brief because I would like to keep our attention focused on the 6 wonderful interns who are the real stars tonight. For the past 8 weeks, I've had the great pleasure of working with Ariel, Brittany, Josh, Savvy, Teddy, and Toy as they learned to navigate the archives and also expanded their technical and creative skills. Alongside them was our community fellow, Stanley Oda, who isn't able to be here with us tonight, but who is a cherished member of our 2022 cohort. Stanley, I don't know if you're watching tonight, but I hope you are. We miss you. We wish you could be here. My partner in this new endeavor was Tai Yamamoto. Tai, wave your hand. To whom I am eternally grateful. I couldn't have done this without him. And I would also like to thank JASC CEO Mike Takada for his constant support. Kei Kawaguchi for always creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere, and Maria Pimentel, who's behind the scenes tonight, for ensuring that our live stream runs very smoothly. Huge thanks also to the enormous team of guest speakers who really took this program above and beyond my wife. And of course, thank you to the National Park Service and the US Department of the Interior for making this whole program possible through a Japanese American Confinement Sites grant. Now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the 6 projects produced by our interns. There are 3 audio projects and 3 video projects. We've arranged them in an alternating sequence. We did add captions because the audio acoustics in this space are not that great. I do want to say the captions were auto-generated, and you may notice some interesting spelling and some interesting punctuation. And I do want you to know that that is not the work of our interns. That is the work of a computer, and we'll just roll with it. I also wanted to say that Toy Suleiman's project was shortened for the purposes of this screening, but we will be posting the full director's cut online in the next couple of days. After the screening, we'll have a Q&A session, so please, online audience and in-person audience, hold your questions until then, and we'll have all 6 interns up front. All righty, let's go.
As in other centers, the colonists upon arrival at their new barracks home are given a bare room and only beds and mattresses. They are not issued a single piece of furniture. A scrap pile of lumber left by the construction workers will serve as the raw material supply for
The Hoppergene of the neighboring community donated trees, which are being planted in each block of this camp. Maybe in about 5 years, we might be able to see some shady trees with really genuine green leaves. In all my life, I have never seen so much dust as I now do daily.
8 decades have passed since President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. While 8 decades seems like a long time, the legacies of the forced incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry can be found across the United States even today, from public memorials to private family scrapbooks. What follows is a collection of historical materials containing the thoughts of real people that lived during the wartime hysteria and racism that led to the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. They weave together to tell the story of the Izui family, a family that is uprooted from their home in Seattle, Washington, to move hundreds of miles across the country to live in vastly unfamiliar landscapes, from the dusty Idaho desert to the faraway Midwestern city of Chicago. Listen to these letters from older brother Victor Sumio Izui and younger brother George Kiyoshi Izui to their uncle, Matakichi, who is incarcerated separately from them in Manzanar in California. Their father, named Mikisaburo, has already been arrested by the FBI and is incarcerated in separate camps run by the Department of Justice for being of the Issei generation and a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War.
Still home, April 7th, 1942. Hello, Uncle. Board said be ready for induction on 20th, but seems everybody is getting notice canceled. Believe mine is canceled too. Dad is at Fort Missoula, Montana, dormitory 33B. Says condition is excellent. Well, expect evacuation any day now. Reception center is being built on Puyallup Fairgrounds. Have found your old Army registration card. We'll send if you need it. Everybody sends regards, Sumio.
Minidoka Preliminary Report in a New Frontier Community. Administrators, colonists strive to solve immediate problems of dust, crowded barracks. The faces of Minidoka reflect the determination of its residents to meet the challenge of arid sageland, wind, and sun on the Idaho desert by Larry S. Tajiri. Last week we spent a day at Minidoka. We met its people and their administrators, tasted its food, choked on its dust. This is a preliminary report. The story of Minidoka will be told in the months, perhaps years to come. This is an impression of Minidoka as it is today, 3 weeks since the arrival of the first evacuee colonists. Minidoka will be a modern American city, frontier style. From U.S. Highway 30, you can see the cloud layers of dust which form an umbrella over Minidoka. There is feverish activity at Minidoka as construction work is speeded to accommodate the trainloads of evacuees arriving from Puyallup and Portland assembly centers. Trucks, churning dust, roar down its unpaved roads. 3,000 white construction workers are building Minidoka under direction of U.S. Army engineers. Minidoka presents a great engineering problem, the construction of the physical features of a community of 10,000 and a great sociological change, the emergency relocation of 10,000 human beings on raw desert land.
September 12th, 1942. Dear Uncle, we came here to Idaho last week. Everyone is okay. Mother will send you a longer letter soon. Our new address is Mrs. S. Izui, 41-3-F, Hunt Branch, Twin Falls, Idaho. Please write to us. Your nephew, Kyo.
Minidoka Report Number 9, Gardens, October 29, 1942, War Relocation Authority Community Analysis Section. Along the streets of the Minidoka Relocation Center, at random intervals, are little gardens, bits of neat landscaping by patient and artistic Japanese. A few weeks ago, the newly built barracks were severe and ugly. The dust was deep around each crude porch, and it swirled like smoke when the wind swept through Minidoka. Minidoka was desiccated, drab, and dusty, but life is not worth living for these people unless they have some green to cultivate. A few brought with them from assembly centers pots of vines or ferns. Most of these withered on the train. Tenderly, they watered these plants after reaching Minidoka to restore the greenness. Some planted radishes and onions as soon as they had watered down the dust, but the majority had nothing. They wandered into the sagebrush and walked along the irrigation and canal bordering the center. Bit by bit, they brought home clumps of grass, mint plants, cattail, reeds, and willows. Some found cactus, desert moss.
Surgery, 310, November 30th, 1942. Dear Uncle, back to work in the hospital, on duty from 12 midnight to 8 a.m. in the dispensary. Kiyoshi is working in the warehouse, Mother is well and occupied most of the time by knitting and crocheting. Weather is fine, just like Seattle, snows one day and rains another. The place is like a pig pen, it gets so muddy. Sugar beets were rotten, couldn't make much. Looks like we get our clothing issued to us any day now. Hot dog. Well, take care of yourself. Mom and Kyo says hello. Victor. Dear Uncle, not much change, except this lousy Idaho rain. Dad sent a homemade chair for Christmas. Otherwise, there's no word from him for the last month. There's going to be 5 big dances tonight, and Kiyoshi's going to take his first date to his first dance. The boy is really growing up. Well, take care of yourself, and here's wishing you a happy new year. Victor. Hospital, February 5th, 7:45 p.m. Dear Uncle, long time, no write. Hope you are well and happy. Are you still having your vacation, or have you started working again? Just received letter and presents from Dad. He sent me lots of hair tonic, hair pomade, soap, hair oil, and a can of pipe tobacco. He's also making those bow dolls again. Started to work in hospital laboratory as assistant lab technician. Sweet place to learn microscopic technique. Snowed 6 inches yesterday, and the place looks beautiful for a change. Lots of coyote and rabbit tracks all around the place. Can hear the old coyote howling away sometimes in the morning. Kiyoshi is still working in the warehouse, and Mother as well, and knitting something all day. Take good care of yourself and write soon. Victor.
April 28th, 1943, Easter Sunday. Dear Uncle, how are you and everyone we know? I am sorry I have not written sooner. We are all okay. Brother enlisted, took the physical exam, and passed. He is now waiting with 250 or so for their final induction call. I hope you understand why he volunteered. He did not do it just because his friends did. He slept over this problem for a week before making his final decision. He wished to get in with the medical unit and have further training along that line. Mother feels quite happy over it, and so do I. Have you received any letter from Dad? We have. And he also sent us quite a lot of studs, which he made there, such as chairs, camp chair, dolls, woven handcrafts, pipe tobaccos, and many other stuffs. I wish that we can go out somewhere far away from here and live, but I guess it's quite impossible as yet. From what I hear, internees like Dad, whose son volunteered for service, are going to be able to come back. That is not to be banked on. True or false, I wish I knew. But we are all hoping that that is possible. But the way, have you Dad's new address? It's Izui Mikisaburo, Camp Livingston Internment Camp. I hope that you were able to read my lousy handwriting. Hope to be hearing from you. Mother shall write soon. Goodbye, Kiyoshi.
September 15th. Dear Uncle, I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. Finished my basic last month. Was promoted to private first class, and they sent me to a medical technician school here in Texas. I'll get my technician 5th grade, corporal, when I get out 2 months from now. Classes and homework keep me pretty, but I know all this stuff, thanks to the hospital experience in Puyallup and Hunt, so it's easy. Hoping to get my 15 days furlough when I get back to Shelby. How are you doing back in camp? Got your cook job back? I don't see why you didn't stay back in Hunt. Well, I hope I hear from you now and then. The address for 2 months is going to be PFC, Victor Izui, El Paso, Texas. Victor.
December 29th, Friday. Hi, Uncle. How are you? Sorry I didn't send you a fine Christmas card, but how was the holiday? Okay? I didn't have such a Merry Christmas, but what can one expect in such a crummy dump as this? I suppose that by now, you people are starting on the fine Mochisuki. We're to do it on the 31st. Maybe I won't do it this year either. I may be too busy at work again. What I wanted to tell you is that Dad will be able to come home and join us for good. A letter from Washington, D.C. came to Mom informing us about it. They're having a negotiation between the FBI and the WRA right now. A mere formality, but as soon as the negotiation, Kosho, is completed, the WRA is supposed to tell us exactly when Dad will be back. I only hope that he can be here before Brother comes home on his furlough. That'll be sometime early next month. I guess you know that Vic Sumio is now a T5, a technician 5th grade corporal. I bet he'll be very happy to know about Dad. Well, I guess I better sign off now. I hope that you have a very happy new year. I can't seem to find any decent greeting cards around here. Please, you'll write, won't you? Goodbye, your nephew, Kiyoshi. P.S. We just received your gift. Mom is very happy about it. Thank you very much. Many boys and girls have left as far as to Chicago, Cleveland, Ohio, and other big eastern cities for work. From what they write back, they say in Chicago it is much easier to find a job than to find a place to live. I know that I can't go out, so I'm not worried.
After the war, members of the Idzui family moved to Chicago, where the process of Japanese American resettlement was already underway. Groups like the Chicago Resettlers Committee and the Chicago Buddhist Church were created not long before and after the end of the war, giving the large amount of Japanese Americans moving to Chicago spaces to rebuild after forced incarceration uprooted their lives. Later on in his life, George Idzui became a sensei for the Japanese martial art of kendo. Before the war, kendo in the Midwest was practically unheard of. In 1975, the Midwest Kendo Federation was formed to connect dojos across the Midwest. George Idzui became an editor for the Sempo, the Federation's newsletter that ran from 1981 to 2002.
I began my kendo training in 1933 when this country was struggling to come out of a depression. Unable to afford a second set of bogu since my brother was already practicing kendo, my father resorted to an unusual method of acquiring a set for me. His friend operated a second-hand rummage shop in the neighborhood where many gems were dug up from among the numerous tables piled full of various articles. During one of his frequent visits, he managed to pick up a very tired-looking main, tare, and two right-handed kote. Later, he also found an ancient-looking do consisting of straight, flat pieces of bamboo held together with leather thongs. Judging from some old illustrations, its existence could have dated it from the latter part of the Edo period or the Meiji period. He mended the worn-out portions of the main and tare as well as he could, and dismantling one of the kote, he turned the first portion inside out to make the necessary mate to the other half.
Here's a clip from Brian Ozaki from the JASC Oral History Collection, talking about his relationship to his heritage and the influence kendo and Idzui sensei had on him.
Kendo I took on later in my life because it has such a deep, strong connection with the Japanese culture. And there's so much in kendo that it provides for me outside of kendo. And it helps me understand my Japanese culture. And it helps me appreciate and why I may do things or why others may do things, because kendo it's really deep into the Japanese culture. And I was lucky enough where the dojo that I belong to is the first kendo dojo in Chicago, and it was based out of BTC. And it was Izui sensei, and he's a very famous sensei. He's passed on, but he believed in teaching the etiquette and the culture of kendo rather than the tournament style of kendo. And so to this day, it's that etiquette is still being taught, and I really appreciate that. That's one of the reasons why I decided to join kendo, is it brought me to a lot of deep cultural roots to who I am.
To this day, I appreciate my father's ingenuity, enthusiasm, and encouragement for our kendo training. The purpose of this article is to impress upon kendo students that a fancy, expensive set of bogu is not a criterion for developing a good kendo persona. Then too, one must not be intimidated by facing an opposition wearing elaborate accoutrements.
This podcast was produced by Brittany Murphy as part of the 2022 Japanese American Service Committee Summer Internship Program. The JASC Legacy Center materials used during this podcast are from the following collections: Idzui Family Papers and Photographs, collection number 2002.014, Ruby Idzui Sempo Midwest Kendo Newsletters, collection number 2010.005, and the Brian Ozaki interview in the JASC Oral History digital collections. This podcast also uses War Relocation Authority documents from the Japanese American Evacuation and Resettlement Records, BANC MSS 67-14C, the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley. Special thanks to Stanley Oda, Josh Reynes, Teddy Wu, and Tai Yamamoto for their voice talents. Special thanks to Karen Kanemoto and Megan Thomas for their correspondence. And a big special thanks to everyone at the JASC Summer Internship for all their support and guidance. Thank you for listening.
Within the fabric of the all American high school experience lies a quintessential object, the yearbook. I'm Joshua Reynes, and in junior year of high school, I quit my yearbook club. Out of sight, out of mind, right? No. Looking at the 1943 year's flight, it seems like the average highlight reel: portraits, clubs, prom queen, sports. Yearbooks are ordinary, maybe a bit mundane. You might cringe flipping through your own, but it's hard to imagine building personal history and legacy without one. There is so much more on and off of these pages. This book and many others like it add layers to Executive Order 9066's impact on Japanese American youth. Within Gila River War Relocation Center, Butte High School was one of two schools for second gen or Nisei teenagers. Censorship, joy, despair, angst, pride, shame. All things felt within this time period for Nisei youth across the country. Looking through this edition, there are hints of what life was like for the JA community: uprooted, displaced, discriminated against, and dehumanized. But ultimately, this book is brimming with the personality and warmth often silenced when looking back at this era. But why is it that this book is decidedly more upbeat than one would assume it would be? Is it censorship? Partially. But the typical administrative censorship doesn't guide the pulse of this annual. It's the principle of structure, stability, routine. Thanks to Year's Flight co-editors Johnny Tachihara and Jun Murawaki, students, especially graduates who move off-site and perhaps enlist in the war, have a chance to write each other best wishes, loads of luck, have a great summer. It contributed to a sense of normalcy for their student body. When you move to a new school, some things won't change. Even though this circumstance was far from normal, reminiscing is crucial. Not to be dramatic, but after quitting yearbook, I never wanted to touch one ever again. But getting a chance to see one from such a pivotal moment in history, I forgot how the craft of creating a yearbook is often taken for granted. How even I took it for granted. Next time you take a look through yearbooks, whether your own or not, try to look back with intent. How did you live through that stage of your life? Also, how much did you know about the state of the world during that time? And how much does it affect what you see on those pages? It may surprise you.
I think history is always important, right? Where you came from.
My name is Sammy Marthru, and this is my podcast. In this episode, I will dive into the multi-generational and historical trauma as a lasting effect of the Japanese incarceration during World War II. Now, this idea did not just come to me. While I was looking through the JASC archives in Chicago, I realized that each object that I held had a story tied to it. I went on a search that led me to JASC's oral histories, where another world was open to me. I am no expert in archival materials, and I have never even heard of oral histories before this summer, but I was instantly drawn in by the numerous stories in front of me. Here, these people were telling their own stories in their own voices. One story stuck out to me since I heard her name earlier this summer: Tanko Dori. I watched her story. Then I watched it again. Here was someone who experienced such a traumatic event, yet she was too young to remember it, as she was only 6 months old when she entered her first relocation center. I listened on and I heard her talk about learning about this event from her family and community, along with the struggle that it was for her to hear the entire story, which led me to do some research on my own. After a couple searches, I discovered that this struggle had a name: trauma.
Trauma, in this case, does not mean a literal clinical diagnosis. Rather, it's more of a term that helps identify the current political and societal discrimination and the continued push for liberation in not only the Japanese American community, but others that are being pushed down by the government and the public as well. Further, the specific trauma that is found across the Japanese American community is historical and multi-generational trauma. Now, I want to take a second to make clear what these two terms are. Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, a leading expert in the psychological field, defines historical trauma as the accumulative emotional and psychological pain over an individual's lifespan and across generations as a result of massive group trauma. Now that is combined with the multi-generational trauma, that is the passage of these emotions and pain from one generation to another. Tonko was born December 6, 1941, the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor. She was too young at the time to remember life in the camps, only being 6 months old when she first arrived at Santa Anita and 2 years old when she left Roar, Arkansas. Hence why
My memories are only things that were told to me about our experience.
some of these stories were from her family.
My family, they're talkers. They're storytellers. So, I heard a lot of things already.
However, these stories did not all come naturally.
Many people say that their parents or their grandparents never told them anything, so they don't know anything. But because I'm a questioner, and my father always said, "Why do you ask so many questions?" I said, "How will I learn if I don't ask?" So I always asked them, and they told me.
Not everyone was able to be as open as Tonko.
I asked my sister-in-law, Grace, to tell the story because she told the story many times. But when she stood there in front of people, I didn't expect her to break down and cry because it's a story she always told without emotion. Now, my husband was 6 years old. I think he still had to have been affected, but he doesn't talk about it. And when he was in the hospital for his back surgery, he was a little loopy, And so a psychiatrist came in and wanted to talk to him, but he would not talk to her about anything old or hurtful.
Another way that Tonko, along with many others in her situation, connected with her community was where she lived. Her first place after the concentration camps was a hostel in Cincinnati.
So practically the entire building was filled with JAs, Japanese Americans, until they moved on. So it was kind of nice. As kids, we would run up and down, and we knew all the obasan and oji-san, old ladies and uncles and aunties. Obasan is auntie, oji-san is uncle. Yeah, it was a good place for us.
Japanese American all-club reunions were also held to exchange stories.
That friendship that they had in those years, their teenage years, their adolescent years, was the most important thing in their life. They felt important. That friendship was something special because they were like people. There are people that came who are millionaires, multimillionaires. There are people that get by on Social Security. They belong to the same club. But when they get together and they're talking, they don't focus on today. They focus on the happy times they had in those days. We haven't held an all-club reunion for a few years because of the age of the people. They don't travel well to Las Vegas. But I thought of having an all-camps reunion before people were unable to tell their story. It's interesting how many people you meet who knew you when you were a child or knew your family when you were in camp. There's kind of a kinship. Histories and stories, if you talk and our shared histories are the same, somehow you'll find a connection.
These stories were not the only thing that Tonko's generation shared.
My age group, everybody named their children with English names. But, that always surprises me that they didn't give them any Japanese names. If you were born pre-war, 1941 or over, you usually had a Japanese name. If you have an English name, that name was given to you by someone, not legally. Like Setsko, say. I know somebody who's teacher, they said, oh, that's too hard for everyone. We'll call you Sue. So they gave her, that's kind of taking your identity away from you. But if you are a child and you want to fit in, you accept it. You want to have an English name, right? Sue. That's very American. I see a reversal now. I see a lot of young people like SJ, like her age. They're naming their children with Japanese names. If not the first name, the middle name for sure. But many people are giving their children first name Japanese. Whereas before, people would, English names.
Tonko's story reveals what life was like from the perspective of someone who experienced incarceration firsthand. This is the part where SJ comes into play. SJ is Tonko's granddaughter, which is 2 generations after the incarceration. However, the impact is still present in her life.
It was never like a, hey, SJ, let's sit down and let's tell you our family history. I did get that, but I had to ask for it. It was kind of just one-off statements about like, oh, like in camps we did this. Oh, we met in camp, or learning about like how they came to Chicago. It's like, oh, all people from camps like came to Chicago. Not everyone. I had to like ask them to sit down and have an intentional conversation about it. But like before then, like they would just bring up like little things here and there about camp life. Growing up, my like grandparents would always have their friends over at their house, and I would go to like events with them every now and then, but I was never really personally integrated into the community just because I just wasn't around other young people my age that were Japanese American. And so that was definitely like the first time that I sort of felt a sense of JA Chicago community.
To fill in the gaps in her own family history, SJ had to branch out and look to the American education system.
When I was in undergrad, I took a whole Asian American Studies class focused on Japanese American incarceration during World War II. We also like took a trip to DC. I think that was like a really impactful moment for me, like being in a class with mostly other like Asian American students. There was maybe like 1 or 2 other Japanese American students in the class and learning about this history. Shortly after that, I had applied to the Contra Project, which is an identity development program, a community building program. And also we just got to learn about like our own families, like personal histories. And that was really impactful for me. I remember like my grandma had sort of been telling me over and over again, like, oh, like you should apply to Contra Project, you should apply to Contra Project. And I was just like, no, it doesn't feel like the right time, because I really wanted to make sure that like I had an understanding of the history before I went on this really, I guess, like emotionally heavy and really like intense trip to actually visit one of the sites. And so I waited until after I had finished that class in undergrad to apply. And I'm really glad I did. I think that was like the first time I was around other like Japanese Americans who were my age, and it connected me with the JA Chicago community.
Through these trips and academic avenues, SJ was able to learn more than just history.
I think I really appreciated the emphasis on being like multiracial. There was like a lot of emphasis that you're not really half of anything, like you're 100% everything that you are. And I think for a while, like I had insecurities about like being multiracial and being quote unquote half Japanese. But I think like realizing that the like JA community is like so incredibly diverse. Most people in my generation are multiracial or like mixed ethnicities, sort of feeling a sense of belonging in the community, acceptance, I think was like really impactful for me, especially like at that stage in my life. A lot of the people grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly white suburbs, where they didn't really have a way to get connected to other people who were Japanese American. And so they actively had to apply to the Contra Project to try and build that community. Whereas folks in like my dad's generation, like they grew up going to Japanese school, like they grew up surrounded by, other Japanese Americans, but they were sort of pushed to assimilate into whiteness and white culture and sort of reject anything that was associated with being Japanese. And I feel like now there's a little bit of a shift with people in my generation and people who are younger, so like still in high school, or people like actually do want to be reconnected with their cultural identities and racial ethnic backgrounds.
She has also noticed these connections in Chicago.
One of the filmmakers who used to live in Chicago created this online resource about resettlement in Chicago, tracking like these 3 families, like stories from camp to Chicago and then their children and like their grandchildren and like what identity and the incarceration experience was like for them. And that was like a really interesting, like really creative way of learning about multi-generational impact of camp. And that was like a really interesting way to sort of facilitate intergenerational healing among folks from all over the place with no connection to each other.
Now, is this connection enough?
I think it depends on how large of a population of Japanese Americans who live in like a particular place. Like my context is like Chicago. And so I would say that there's a lot being done. Like I wish that more members of the Japanese American community would move beyond just learning about retelling history and more about action and like activism to like continue to build solidarity with other communities who are currently affected by these issues, rather than just like focusing on retelling history, which is important, but I think there needs to be a balance between the two.
Tonko and SJ are just 2 stories out of thousands, but their stories are unique and hold so much power. Many have shared and are available for those who look. If you want to listen to more of Tonko's story, or the stories of countless other Japanese Americans, head over to the JASC Legacy Center's website to listen to many others. However, listening to these stories are just the first step. These oral histories and conversations are gateways to gain a better understanding of what happened and learn more about their community's past and open up more conversations. It is our responsibility to take it one step further. These resources are only known to select groups and are not broadcasted to the general public very often, so please share these stories and make these resources known to others, even if it is simply bringing it up to your friends or family after listening to this episode.
If you see something wrong, you have to speak up. You have to say, you have to vote. No one spoke for the Japanese people when they were taken to camp. The Japanese people themselves went to camp without much pressure. Some people blame the JCL for not making a stronger stand, but are you going to fight thousands of men with guns? No. If you see something, you hear something, you read something, you say something, and you write in response.
My name is Savvy Marthru, and thank you for listening to my podcast. This episode was made possible by the oral histories and archives at the Japanese American Service Committee Legacy Center in Chicago. I also reference materials from the American Psychology Association and the Japanese American Citizens League. I want to take a moment to thank Tonko and SJ Doran for sharing their voices so this is all possible. I also want to thank Emma and Ty, along with my fellow interns at the JASC Legacy Center. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Teddy Wu, and today I'm here to talk about the history of Japanese American food and teach you how to make some manju. Manju is a wheat-based bun typically baked and filled with a sweet bean paste. Today, we're going to be making shiro-an, or white bean manju, using a lima bean filling. I will be combining 2 separate recipes, one for kuri manju and the other for lima bean an by Sumi Shikami. These were found in Oryori, a 1972 compilation cookbook of Japanese American recipes from the Christ Church of Chicago. Let's start with the lima bean paste. We're going to need lima beans, sugar, and salt. These lima beans have been rinsed and soaked overnight, and we should be able to peel the skins right off by hand. Once we've got all the skins off, we'll put them into a pot with some new water and bring them up to a simmer for around an hour or 2. As it simmers, try to skim off any foam that comes to the surface of the water in order to keep the color of the paste as white as possible. We'll know it's done when we can take a bean and mash it with our fingers. Lima bean manju is very symbolic of Japanese American cooking in its blending of 2 different cultures. Arriving from China in the 1300s, manju is one of Japan's oldest wagashi, or traditional sweets, and they've been enjoyed at tea ceremonies and festivals for centuries. In the early 20th century, manju made its way to Japantowns across America's west coast, where they were sold commercially at sweet shops like Fugetsudo in Los Angeles and Ben Kyodo in San Francisco. In the 1950s, American scientists had taken lima beans from Peru and engineered new crops to grow quickly. They hit the shelves of post-war grocery stores and soon became a household staple for their shelf stability. Japanese Americans found them to be an easy substitute for the native Japanese white beans, and today, lima beans have become the worldwide standard for use in shiroan. Now that the beans are cooked, let's drain the liquid and move the beans to a food processor. Let it run for a minute or two until the beans are the size of sand grains. Then, we'll transfer a little bit at a time into a fine mesh strainer. Take a wooden spatula and press the beans through the strainer, and we'll see that a really nice smooth paste forms on the other side. We'll do this until all the beans are pushed through. Now that we have our paste, let's sweeten it up. Put the paste back into the pot and add salt and half of the sugar. Once the sugar is dissolved, give it a taste and add more if you'd like. Once we're happy with the sugar level, let it simmer for about 30 minutes. We'll know it's done once we can draw a line in the pan like this. Transfer it to a container and let it cool. Alright, we're ready to make the manju dough. For this, we're going to need butter, sugar, eggs, evaporated milk, vanilla extract, baking soda, and all-purpose flour. Cream the butter and sugar together with a mixer, then we'll add one of our eggs, evaporated milk, and vanilla extract, mixing well after we add each one. In a separate bowl, let's sift and combine our flour and baking soda, then fold it into our wet batter in parts, making sure we don't overmix the dough until it no longer sticks to the bowl. Wrap it in plastic and place it in the fridge to chill for an hour. Before World War II, Japanese American cooking was largely confined to the household. That changed when Japanese American families were forcibly removed from their homes under Executive Order 9066 and sent to incarceration camps. The food at camp was cooked in assembly lines, served at mess halls, and could hardly be considered Japanese or American food. As the war in the camps came to an end, the War Relocation Authority used the opportunity for resettlement to intentionally separate Japanese American communities and disperse pre-war Japantowns that existed on the West Coast. In addition, Japanese Americans were relocated under the pretense that they must renounce their native language and culture and assimilate into American society. Despite these tensions, Japanese Americans continued to build their own community networks through churches, mutual aid organizations, and neighborhood hangouts. The food they cooked became a central web that held together many of these networks, which hosted picnics and potlucks, cooked meals to those in need, and invented their own hybrid Japanese American recipes to sell. In this way, post-war Japanese American cooking shifted from being bound to the home to being shared with communities that they built. Many of these new recipes found their way into Japanese American cookbooks, often compiled by local church groups, and largely sold to sansei who sought to reclaim the foods they grew up with. Scholar Valerie Matsumoto says that perhaps no other ethnic minority has produced more compilation cookbooks than Japanese Americans. These recipes continue to be shared today at cooking classes hosted by JASC. Now we're all ready to make the manju. First, we'll preheat our oven to 350, then we'll take the dough and split it into 12 roughly equal pieces. Take one and flatten it into a palm-sized circle, making sure the edges are thinner than the center. Take a ball of shiroan and place it in the center of the dough, then fold and pinch up the sides around it. Once we have 12 of them, we'll separate and beat the whites of one egg into a separate bowl and brush each bun with the mixture. Now we'll throw them into the oven for around 20 minutes. Once they're golden brown, let's take them out and let them cool. Cooking stuff like this is a really important way of continuing the sort of resistance to what Japanese American food has endured over time and over history. It's really important to be able to continue to learn about this, to be able to have access to cook these kinds of foods, and to understand that You know, these foods don't just exist in a vacuum and aren't just cooked for sustenance or for enjoyment. They really serve a much larger purpose of keeping a community together and holding on to a culture that was destined to be lost, if not for some folks who really wanted to keep it alive.
Please be advised that the following podcast includes discussion of violence, sexual assault, murder, and death. So I'm looking through the archives, trying to find anything that I can pertaining to Okinawan people, what Okinawan people experienced during World War II, what they experienced during the incarceration. But after going through box after box, I am not finding anything. But then I run into this miscellaneous black book, and I open it, and it's a photo album with a note taped to the inside of the front cover. And that note reads, "For Jerry Katayama, photo record of the Okinawa battle, the longest and most costly of the Pacific War." And I'm like, wow, I think I found it. My name is Toy, and I've spent my summer in the archives searching for information about Okinawan people. What you just heard was how I found a photo album that documents Okinawa during World War II. Okinawa is an island in the South Pacific Ocean that was annexed by Japan in 1879. During World War II, it was the site of the infamous Battle of Okinawa, which took the lives of up to 150,000 civilians. The locals that remained spent the next 27 years under U.S. rule, but what most people don't know is that from 1945 to 1946, the U.S. military imprisoned the entire population of Okinawa in 16 internment camps, pictures of which are in that black book. In this episode, we will draw the incarceration of Okinawans in context with the incarceration of Japanese and Okinawan Americans in the United States by following the stories of 3 people. Number 1, Jerry Jiro Katayama, a Japanese American soldier who was deployed to Okinawa. Number 2, George Higa, an Okinawan American who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain and husband to number 3, Misao Higa, an Okinawan American who survived the Battle of Okinawa. The photo album in question was a gift to Jerry from one of his friends stationed with him in Okinawa. Jerry grew up and attended university in Utah. He was living in Salt Lake City in 1942 when Executive Order 9066 was issued, eliciting the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast and into incarceration camps. Since they were already inland, Jerry and his family in Utah were able to stay home with certain travel restrictions. But the same can't be said for his older brother.
I think my brother was living in San Francisco because when the evacuation came, he was incarcerated in Topaz. When my brother got married to Yuki, I took my folks down for the wedding. They attended the wedding in camp. Guard houses all around, barbed wire. It was not comfortable.
By visiting his brother in Topaz, Jerry saw the conditions of the incarceration camps firsthand. But where were George and Misao Higa at the beginning of the war? Let's listen to their eldest son, Bob, tell the story.
My name is Bob Higa, born in Chicago, which is where my dad, George, my mom, Misao, lived and raised us. My dad is born in California, my mom born in Hawaii, but traveled to Okinawa to take care of her father. My dad's parents passed away early in his life, and then he went to live with relatives in California.
George would first be imprisoned at the Santa Anita horse track, then sent to Heart Mountain in Wyoming. His youngest son, Perry, remembers stories of how his father could temporarily escape the incarceration.
My name is Perry Tadashi Higa. One way to get out of the prison is that you can go off and work in a factory, or you can go off and work in a farm. Once you're done, then you are sent back to the camp.
Another, more permanent way to get out of the camps was to enlist in the military, which is exactly what Jerry's older brother did in 1943. Jerry would follow in those footsteps soon after.
I was inducted at Fort Douglas military installation in Salt Lake City. Soon after that, I volunteered for the service.
The service that Jerry volunteered for was the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS, a unit trained in the Japanese language, specializing in translation, interpretation, and interrogation, comprised almost entirely of second-generation Japanese Americans. This takes us to the first page in Jerry's album of black and white photos. Pictured is an image of barracks, lined up in a bleak, snowy field. I would have thought it was one of the incarceration camps if it weren't for the caption written as follows. The beginning of our journey in the Military Intelligence Service at Camp Savage, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our home and school were in abandoned homeless barracks. Seeing this, I thought, why would such an important military force be housed in this place? Well, the MIS was originally established in San Francisco, California, but after Executive Order 9066, Japanese American military personnel were also forced inland. Minnesota's governor offered up this deserted public housing facility, and it became the language school that Jerry trained in.
Then I sent to Camp Savage. I had a very intense course in Japanese. I went out in the field for interrogating captured Japanese soldiers.
After finishing a campaign in the Philippines, Jerry was deployed to Okinawa. In the photo album, there is a page dedicated to the day his MIS unit touched down on the island. Pictured is an image from behind Jerry's helmeted head, looking out on a beaten path. Next to it is a note reading, "We landed on Okinawa soil on April 2nd, 1945. D-Day +1. Leading us in is Jerry Katayama." That was the first day after the U.S. invasion of Okinawa began. As the battle ensued, local people often got caught in the crossfire. Misao was a school teacher in southern Okinawa, struggling to survive alongside her sisters.
The school children were sent to caves in the mountains where there were supplies. Their mission was to hide. My mom and her sisters went to the cave and were turned away because there was no room. They hooked up with the retreating Okinawan Japanese infantry and survived by carrying wounded soldiers on their backs and trying to evade the U.S. forces. One of the sisters was killed by incoming artillery, and everybody in the cave that they were released from or turned away from was killed. They had soldiers with flamethrowers that wiped everybody out.
For Misao and her sisters, there was little option but to join the mobilization of Japanese soldiers in order to survive the indiscriminate fire of the U.S. military. Those who weren't killed were captured, and Jerry's job was to interrogate those prisoners. The album contains a photo of 10 MIS soldiers as they sit in the back of a truck. Underneath is a note reading, "Whenever we're ordered to move, we always go first class. After all, we're the Army's secret weapon." One of the following pages is labeled MIS Men Interrogating POWs, Prisoners of War. In one photo, a large group of male prisoners sits on the dirt ground in rows. Some of them are in Japanese military uniform, while others aren't. Crouched amongst them with a clipboard in hand is one of the Japanese American MIS soldiers. His face is circled so as to firmly differentiate him from the prisoners. 3 white U.S. soldiers stand just outside the group, monitoring the interrogation from above. and surrounding the scene is a multitude of tents and lines of barbed wire
How long have you
fence.
been on this island? 冒頭に何ヶ月いるんですか？冒頭には今1年ちょっとですな。A little over a year. How is the condition of supplies of the Japanese force at the present?
Just below that is a very different photo. In it, there is a large cluster of Okinawan locals, mostly women and children, standing in line before a couple of Japanese American MIS soldiers. At the front of the image, a young Okinawan woman walks away from the collective while clutching a sack of her belongings. She glances to the side uneasily, maybe even fearfully, as the soldiers watch her intently. Seeing all this, I wondered if these could be photos of the internment camps, but Jerry makes no explicit mention of camps or prisons in his recollection of Okinawa. And much like myself a couple weeks ago, Misao's sons didn't even know these camps existed.
I had no idea that there were camps in Okinawa as well. I don't know anything about that.
Although there are records and a field of scholars who can confirm these internment camps existed, it seems that in general, people don't talk about them. Even Okinawan Americans like me don't know about them. I decided to ask an expert, Ayuko Takeda, about why that is.
My name is Ayuko Takeda, and I'm a PhD candidate in history at UC Irvine. Currently, I'm working on my dissertation about the U.S. military civilian internment of local people in Okinawa. So I mainly examine U.S. military reports, but also personal accounts of the local people who were interned. So when I reached out to them, they were really surprised. And they said, do you really want to hear about internment story instead of the Battle of Okinawa? So that also indicates not so many people are aware of the internment history or want to know more about the Battle of Okinawa, but at the same time, that marginalized experiences of the internment.
By conducting oral histories of the internment camps, Ayuko found there was a serious lack of attention to the topic. Even those who remember aren't used to talking about it, and if others aren't asking, it's unlikely that they would want to relive those experiences. Being intentional and asking the right questions was essential to understanding history. That being said, it's about time we look for more answers. From the battle in 1945 to the post-war period in 1946, how exactly did the U.S. military administer the internment camps in Okinawa?
There's 16 camps in the main island and remote island of Okinawa, and those camps were administered differently. People living in the north were interned in earlier stage from their home village, and they were ordered to relocate to camps the U.S. military established and instead used those lands to construct airfields. In terms of the southern camps, the U.S. military captured those wounded and injured civilians who were involved in the fierce battles between U.S. and Japanese forces.
Misao was amongst those captured by the U.S. military after the battle ended.
I do know at the end of the war, my mom and her sister were hiding, as were many of the Okinawans up in the mountains. The U.S. forces would come by with microphones announcing that this is the end of the war, come out. Of course, that was met with skepticism, but ultimately they did.
The capture of those hiding in the mountains was called cave flushing, and after cave flushing came interrogation, both of which were carried out by the MIS soldiers.
Interrogation was to make sure that those people were civilians, not Japanese soldiers. The U.S. military interned civilians and soldiers in different camps. So those Japanese soldiers disguised wearing the Okinawan civilian clothes, but soldiers often entered civilian camps and pick up those Japanese soldiers. So the interrogation continued even after the civilian camps.
The differentiation between soldier and civilian was complicated since many locals were mobilized by the retreating Japanese forces. Boys and men were recruited as combatants, while girls and women like Misao provided medical care. Gender played a big role in the civilian versus soldier separation. However, the U.S. military equally prioritized the ethnic distinction between Okinawan and Japanese people as a means of building a positive narrative around their actions.
The US military tried to emphasize its liberation of colonized people from Japanese brutal rule. So in that sense, the US military had some kind of differentiation between Okinawan and Japanese men. But the US military generally interned women and girls without questioning so much about whether they should be in a prisoners of war camps. But I should add, there's a lot of sexual violence and sexual assaults rampant through the internment periods.
Along with sexual violence, Ayuko's interviewees remembered a multitude of dangers that they faced while imprisoned, negating the narrative of U.S. benevolence. According to recent estimates, at least 3,000 Okinawans died in the internment camps.
The military say it's not their responsibility, basically, for the deaths of those people, but many people were actually killed because of the conditions, even though the US military provided food rations or other supplies that was not sufficient. They suffered starvation, insanitary conditions at the camps.
The inhumane circumstances that the U.S. military forced local Okinawans into echoes experiences of the incarceration in America's home front. What is particularly interesting is how the military carefully separated Japanese people from Okinawan people in Okinawa, but did the absolute opposite in the U.S. Just like his American citizenship, George's Okinawan heritage was completely disregarded during the incarceration. The U.S. government should not be able to say that they care about Okinawan liberation while in the same breath imprisoning Okinawan Americans in their own country. The same injustice lies in how the U.S. military enlisted the service of Japanese Americans like Jerry, placing them in the most deadly situations imaginable, while their families were not even afforded basic human rights back home. Even today, it makes me furious. But in our families, such anger is hardly ever expressed openly.
And our heritage is one to keep everything within, don't complain, be courteous, be respectful. So coming from that background, I don't think it was in them, or even in us, to speak badly of the U.S. military, even if they did a lot of things that weren't right. Certainly going into the internment camps wasn't right. And that, over a period of time, gnaws at me personally. I mean, they weren't camps. I mean, let's call it what it is. It was a prison.
I couldn't agree more. But that brings us to the conversation of what we should call the sites where Japanese and Okinawan people were imprisoned. On the American side of things, we've been moving away from the phrase internment camp. But with regards to the imprisonment of Okinawan locals, the more important distinction is between the terms internment camp and refugee camp.
Using the word internment camps is more controversial in the case of Japanese American camps because the internment has connotation of denying the fact that the majority of incarcerated people were American citizens. But I think for the internment of Okinawans, they were not Americans. So the reason why I'm using the term internment is to emphasize that it wasn't refugee camps. The term internment camp was interchangeably used with refugee camps in the US military records. That means the US military was aware that it was internment, not just to evacuate war refugees at camps. Those local Okinawan civilian people remembered their internment. They were treated as not the protected, but instead as prisoners.
So calling these sites internment camps has the effect of acknowledging their true carceral purpose. Being that this history is hardly recognized, simply uttering the phrase, U.S. military internment camps in Okinawa, is a powerful statement. Wielding this knowledge, I looked back into Jerry's photo album. I looked at the truck full of MIS soldiers and wondered if they were heading into the mountains on a cave flushing mission or into the camps on an interrogation assignment. I looked at the imprisoned men and wondered if they were soldiers who disguised as local Okinawans or local Okinawans who got pegged as soldiers. I looked at the group of civilians and wondered if they were lined up for food rations, examination, or both. I looked at the woman with fear in her eyes and wondered if she made it out of there all right. I looked at all this, then said to myself with assurance, these were internment camps. Jerry spent the rest of his life in Chicago and passed away in 2009 at the age of 93. He left a wealth of items, including that photo album, to the archives at the Japanese American Service Committee. George also remained in Chicago and passed away in 2020 at the age of 97. He is survived not only by his sons, Bob and Perry, but by his wife Misao, who will turn 97 in 2022. Looking back, I never would have guessed that my mission to find information about Okinawan people would take me into Jerry's miscellaneous black book, let alone that it would lead to finding a part of incarceration history that I never knew existed. Still, there's a lot more to learn from the archives, the scholars, and the Okinawan people connected to this history. In other words, this journey is far from over. My name is Toy Suleiman, and this has been the Internment in Okinawa podcast. Source citations and credits for this episode can be accessed online at bit.ly/internment in Okinawa. This podcast was completed as a project for the JASC Legacy Center's Summer Internship Program 2022 in Chicago, Illinois. Big thanks to the following people who made it possible: Linda Asato, Amy Doe, Bob Higa, Perry Higa, Emma Saito Lincoln, Stanley Oda, Ayuko Takeda, Gail K. Yamada, Tai Yamamoto, the entire staff at JASC, and my fellow interns, Ariel, Brittany, Josh, Savvy, and Teddy. Finally, thanks to you for listening.
I think they all deserve another big round of applause. All right, I hope that you have some questions for these incredible people. Who wants to go first?
First of all, thank you everyone for sharing your projects with us. I just kind of want to know what your experience was like working in the archives this summer. Was it the first time you all have engaged in that kind of work? And how do you ask questions of the archive, but how do you also let the archive guide the questions you ask in your projects?
Thank you for that question. So for me, it was my first time working with archival materials such as this. So a lot of the credit goes to Emma for teaching us how to properly interact with these materials, not to damage them, but also how to ask the right questions and find information. It also really helped that there was like online information about what was in the archives as well to help contextualize the information. And as far as how it impacted my project, I definitely went in with a goal, but then what you actually find from the archives changes everything as you go along. So you have to learn to be flexible. But overall, the experience is just really amazing and kind of emotional, being able to touch and be in presence with these things. Yeah.
Yeah, like similar to what Toy was saying, I've never been in an archive institute ever, and I had no idea what to expect. So just seeing how like diverse the archive materials themselves are, because it's not like it was very heavily enforced that this is not a library, this is not a museum, it's an archive, and being able to see like all the different kinds of materials, because there's like paintings, there are books, but like even in just the case back there, you never know what you're going to find. And being able to see that there's a person and their family and their story, and especially with the collection, like seeing how it all just comes together is really fascinating.
I definitely have to go off of what Savvy said. It's definitely really amazing. It's a really emotional experience to go through, honestly. I haven't really been in an archives before, so thank you again, Emma, for teaching us everything and guiding us. But I remember, I think it was our first day, we were going through a collection together and we were looking at a journal. And on January 1st, 1945, after they got out of incarceration camp, it just had one sentence there saying that this year really means a lot to me. Everything seems so much brighter now. And it's just finding moments like that in the archives, that just really reminds you of why it's really important that we are here and why we are telling these stories. We can move on to the next question if anyone has any.
This thing's pretty durable if you can throw it. Yes.
Before joining this program, did you know about the Japanese American internment or incarceration of Japanese Americans? Did you know about it? Did you study about it in school?
So I could start with this. So I graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in Asian American Studies. And every semester of my undergraduate years, we delve pretty deep into this topic. Almost every single class that I can think of, we have. So I've been pretty familiar with the history and everything that went on in the context of history books. So that was the difference of learning here and learning in the archives.
Yeah, as well. So I knew about incarceration from a very young age. My grandmother was actually incarcerated at Gila River. So this kind of this history was very personal to me, and so I had written some letters to my grandmother in the 7th grade about her experience in the camps and after the camps. And I went to school for political science, and I ended up writing a thesis about Asian American mass incarceration as well. So doing this kind of work was just another angle at looking at this history that's so important to continue to learn about and explore.
I only knew a minimal amount, just from like primary school, from high school. it was like one unit, maybe even one page, and then that's it. And that's all you learn when you're covering like World War II. And then throughout undergraduate, not so much, but there was one class that I took. It was actually right at the beginning of like online schooling and the pandemic. So there wasn't actually a lot of access. It was a public history class. There wasn't a lot of access to like in-person like exhibits, museums. That was probably what I was most excited for those classes. But just like shifting to online, seeing how we had to adapt, like all of those institutions that you're looking at had to adapt as well. So I found a couple like digital archives with like a lot of video. I think particularly from a center in Northern California, maybe San Francisco. So that is sort of like the start of like my interest in not only like public history, but also digital archives as well.
So yeah, similar to Teddy, I also have a personal connection to it. My grandfather was incarcerated at Santa Anita and then Heart Mountain, so I grew up kind of knowing about it through that. However, it wasn't something that was really talked about a lot, at least with my grandfather. I had some other family members who were more open about discussing it, but my granddad, if I asked him about it, he would kind of like make a joke and like gloss over it. So I tried to do most of my learning from when I was little, like reading books about it. But then coming into this internship, I thought I knew a lot more than I did, was what I discovered, especially with learning about internment in Okinawa and all of that. But yeah.
I'm sure that you're aware that last year, the state of Illinois signed into law, Governor Pritzker signed into law the TEACH Act, which mandates that all public schools in Illinois will have to study Asian American history, not just Japanese, not Chinese, but all Asians. So it will give all Asian people the opportunity to have their stories heard, not just the white stories or the black stories, but the Asian stories.
We have a question from one of our remote audience members. And Marie says, I was so impressed with how polished all the projects were. So I'm wondering if this experience has motivated any of you to think about different study or career options than you had previously.
Yeah, so like I said previously, I went to school for political science, and so when I was writing my thesis and doing all this research, a lot of the things I was learning were all very statistical, very kind of like macro level, like step back from real stories and real experiences that where I was learning about. And so I think being able to work, this is also my first time working in an archives and in like a public history format. So I think that really having this kind of experience and being a part of this internship has been such a blessing to be able to uncover, firsthand real life experiences, either whether that's through oral histories or whether that's through artifacts and documents. And so it's really influenced the way that I think about history and the way that it is important to tell stories involving these artifacts as well, not just, recounting statistics and recounting, very detached narratives. I think it's so important to involve this kind of work and involve these kinds of, things.
It's online. Okay. I'm a communications major, so this was really helpful in terms of finding not only a medium that I could work with, but also just like material. Like there's archives here in Chicago, and there's archives all across the country, and even back at school, I'm a rising junior, so I can go back to campus and bring this back there as well. So this internship has really kind of just opened my eyes to the multimedia avenues.
I just graduated college in June from DePaul, and I graduated with a degree in film. And seeing what I learned, specifically film editing, seeing what I learned from that curriculum, it was very much more like narrative based. Like, here's how you write this, here's how you make a commercial, and do things like that. And I had already had interest in public history by that point when I was starting to do a lot more editing and just seeing a lot of like the content and like a lot of like the audio visual resources and supplemental materials that you see. I know that like my preconceived notions were like, oh, a documentary is Ken Burns photo zooming in kind of slow, 4 hours long. And like when I was making my project, I was like, I had like a more like a younger audience in mind too, and I wanted to like sort of like make that accessible, and like even though it's not like it won't be like in depth like everything that you may need to know, it is a really great starting point to like learn and delve into like that topic at large.
Yeah, I was wondering, for those of you who reached out to the like families or the people whose documents or like materials were in the archives, what was the process for getting in touch with those people, and like was there any pushback from anyone or things like that?
So the hardest part about getting in touch with people is, it's funny, the communication factor, like lining up everything. So when I reached out to my two people, I went through with Emma, and it was just through email. I mean, 20, like in this modern age, like media and technology has such a big advantage. And I know like some of my fellow interns, like we did our meetings through Zoom as well. So like distance wasn't even a problem. And no, but email just simply like saying who we were and what we wanted to know, and kind of just like leaving it open for them to respond.
You. So I wasn't able to reach out to Jerry Katayama, who was the person from the archives, because he's passed, and then that wasn't necessarily a connection that I made, but I definitely still was thinking about not wanting any pushback from anyone who might have contributed to what he donated. For example, that photo album that I looked at, it was his and he gave it, but it was sent to him by a friend who might not have wanted other people to see it. And there were photos of people in Okinawa that definitely didn't consent to being photographed. So that went into why I decided to do a podcast rather than a video. So I could express it to you through my words rather than just showing things that maybe people didn't want you to see, but still getting across how it's important. And then as far as the people I did get to interview, I was able to get connected through the Okinawa Kenjinkai of Chicago through Linda Sato, who's here somewhere. Hey, yeah. She helped connect me to Bob and Perry, who are her cousins, and they had this incredible story. They're one parent who was incarcerated here and one parent who was in Okinawa, so it was kind of it was just serendipitous, really, that Linda got back to me so quickly. It was really a shot in the dark, but I think I got really lucky because here in Chicago, the community is very tight-knit and people are very willing to help you if you show that you're willing to put in the work and be authentic and do your best and listen to them. So yeah, I feel like we're really fortunate to be in that type of community here. I apologize for that hum. We're at 7:30, so I'm gonna have to draw our Q&A time to a close, but if you're lucky enough to be here in person, you have more time to ask questions with our interns, and we can do it over some lovely refreshments. But I want to be mindful of our remote audience's time. So thank you to our remote audience, and thank you to all of you here in person.
Thank you again to the National Park Service for supporting this entire summer's project, our big experiment. Don't forget to check out our website, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media. And if you're in person, I'm going to ask you to sit tight for just a second because we have one more thing to do after we've ended the live stream. But I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to our remote audience.
What do you think of Emma? Oh.